Welcome to Martin Explores, the show that investigates and looks into all things relating to physical, mental, and spiritual well-being, and some other interesting bits and pieces as well. Given that it is the holy month of Ramadan at the moment, and I think a good billion or maybe more Muslims around the world are going through a month of sacrifice and spiritual reflection, I thought it would be a great idea to do Martin Explores Ramadan. Now, I've got a fantastic guest today. He's not an imam, but he's a very studious, sincere, and spiritual person. You could say a genuine seeker of truth and somebody who wants to do good in the world. I met him through K1 kickboxing at AFK Sheffield, where he's a fantastic trainer, extremely knowledgeable on all things martial arts related. So he's agreed to come onto the show and tell us all about what Ramadan is. Saj Baroo, thank you very much for coming on. How are you?
My pleasure. I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for having me on. And hello to all your viewers and people that might watch this or hear this. So hi to everybody.
Thank you very much, Saj. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. A little bit tired, but I'm good.
Of course, because you're halfway through the fast today.
Yeah, it gets hard as you go along.
Okay, so without any further ado, let's start from the top. What is Ramadan?
Ramadan is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, and it's a month where Muslims observe fasting. The interesting thing here is that Ramadan, actually, if you look at what it means intense heat. It's the first time that the Muslims fasted, it was when it was intensely hot. So that's how the name came about, Ramadan. It means intensely hot. That's the epistemological term in its linguistic form, what it means. So it denotes kind of like sacrifice in terms of giving up food, giving up water, just primarily in that kind of contextual format. Ramadan came about, historically speaking, for your viewers, I'm sure most will know that when the Prophet, peace be upon Prophet Muhammad, was proclaimed his prophethood at 40 years old, and then over a 23-year period, rules and regulations in Islam came over a period of 23 years, 12 years in Mecca and the last 11 years in Medina. Ramadan was made obligatory on Muslims in the second year of Hijrah. Hijrah occurred from like 620 AD. So 622 is when it was made obligatory on Muslims, and that's when the revelation started to appear regarding fasting and Muslims fasting. Interesting is, if for your viewers who want to have a look, Surah Baqarah, which is the chapter number 2, verse 183, where God says to Muslims, "O you who believe, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you, so you may be mindful of God." So here is the nuances here is that the word used is kotaba, which is it is written, right? Which, without going into too much details, other verbs could have been used like fasting was made obligatory, right? But the word is written. It was written. So here there's an emphasis on its divine law, like it was divine law for other nations, the nations of Moses, David, and other prophets before. If you're looking along historical religious lines, if you look at Judaism, Christian, fasting was somewhere in their religious law. So fasting it's just and this verse refers to that. It says, "We have made it, prescribed it for you, like we prescribed it for the other nations." So fasting, that's how kind of like fasting has its nuanced approach to Muslims. So that's why it was made obligatory on Muslims. So once it's made obligatory, then the question is the nuts and bolts of how we fast, and what kind of like. So that's the reasoning by why we fast, is because it's been prescribed to us as Muslims. So every person, every Muslim who is of an appropriate age who can fast should fast. Okay, there are some rules to that. The sick, the old. There's some dispensation for those who can't fast, but generally, any fit adult Muslim should fast. It's ordained in the Quran, so that they should fast. Now, fasting, we might ask, well, what does it entail? I mean, most Muslims, probably all Muslims know what it does, but non-Muslims per se probably haven't got an idea. We fast from sunrise to sunset, right? So we get up before the sun rises, so 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, whatever time, eat, pray, then obviously, and then spend our rest of the day doing what we do, and then before the sun sets, or when the sun sets, when it gets dark, then we open as fast. Now, the interesting thing here, it's fasting is abstinence from, in its kind of like physical form, abstinence from food, water, and intimate contact.
There are other aspects as well, are there not, with regards to things like reflection, generosity and kindness. I know some people equate it to, well, certainly Eid on the other side, to Christmas almost. So what are the other elements of Ramadan other than those things, other than the things you can't do?
Okay, so in terms of the benefits of fasting, I mean, just the physical benefits, it's interesting that many top-end athletes, high-level athletes, are now intermittently fasting. Quite a few people who do mixed martial arts, obviously, you're aware, they'll use intermittent fasting as part of their training program because of the underlying health benefits. Interesting that since probably like the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of research around fasting and its physical benefits. That's why high-end athletes are now doing intermittent fasting, because what they found is actually physically it benefits them. It's giving their body a rest. And with that, in the Sunnah is what the Prophet said or did. There's certain foods that he prescribed, said that when you open your fast, you should have watermelon or you should have dates. And so these things, there are medicinal benefits of having such foods. Watermelon washes your gut out, has minerals and replenishes the water. So there's all sorts of kind of physical benefits in terms of that aspect of fasting.
Neither Saj Baroo or myself are medical or nutritional experts. However, I am aware that there's a lot of evidence about the benefits of fasting, and there's also warnings as well. So do your homework before you decide to do this, and make sure that you check with your GP to make sure it's all right.
If you've got underlying health issues, then there's for Muslims, certainly, if you've got underlying health issues, there are dispensations within Islam not to fast or to do it in a different kind of methodology. So I do have to just point that out. So for example, somebody who's diabetic or somebody that's severely asthmatic, where they have to take medication, then fasting is not prescribed for them. They have a dispensation from fasting. I must make that point clear, because that's a really important point in the fasting methodology. Now, in terms of kind of like religious benefits of fasting for Muslims, I mean that's I think an interesting discussion point. There's an interesting, the story of Moses. Right, in the Bible. It's mentioned in the Quran as well, the story of Moses. Now, I have a really interesting take on this particular story. So, And I want to just discuss this first, and then I'll get to the point of why Ramadan and its benefits. So Pharaoh had a system going in Egypt where he was hoarding, quite materialistically hoarding, and creating a very big empire that was, magnificent in terms of material wealth and prosperity. So along comes Moses. God sends Moses to Pharaoh to say, your egos are getting a little bit too big here. Calm down a little bit. Pharaoh didn't listen, and those people who listened to Moses, he took them from that environment to a more egalitarian environment where they were returning back to nature, returning back to natural living. So my take on the story of Moses and Pharaoh is one where God was telling the people to return back to natural living. Instead of hoarding and consuming beyond their limits, he was calling them back to nature to get a balance between eating and living and a more spiritual kind of being apart with nature and not over hoarding, not overusing resources. Now, this is an interesting point here, because when we talk about spirituality and the link to God, everybody's got a different opinion of what spirituality is. In Islam, our spirituality is founded on the idea of returning back to God, returning back to nature, returning back to oneself. Ramadan is a month. It's a time for contemplation for Muslims to reorientate themselves back to God, to have humility. A famous sheikh from the Indian subcontinent said, the path of spirituality is to have humility and humbleness. And this is the essence of Ramadan, is for Muslims. That's why God says in the famous hadith, which is a saying of the Prophet said that in this month, God gives directly to Muslims instead of going through cause, because we live in the world of cause and effect, but God gives directly. So Muslims are encouraged to do good actions in Ramadan, contrary to what they normally do. So the fortunate thing is we're in a corona lockdown, so most Muslims can actually spend the day, resting, sleeping, and actually spending their time in doing worship or reading the Quran, praying, and being around family. And that's what we are encouraged to do in Ramadan, is spend more time with family, spend more time contemplating and actually thinking about what we're actually doing in our lives. Are we over hoarding, overeating? Ramadan's not just about kind of like abstaining from food. Some people just hoard food, they just eat. And for them, because they can't eat, they are tailoring their eating patterns, right? But it's also about kind of recognizing, what am I looking at? What am I listening to? What am I saying? Am I actually reflecting about my daily actions? Am I actually following Islam? Am I following the Sunnah? Am I doing what the Prophet ﷺ prescribed? Am I actually being a good Muslim? Am I caring about my neighbor? Am I caring about Joe people next door, the person on the street, the poor person? What about in a place where, in other parts of the world where people have got no food or they've got no medication, they're living hand to mouth, in effect. What am I doing to help them? So Ramadan is an important time of reflection, to reflect on, not just what my own actions are, but how am I dealing with people? How am I dealing with other people? Not just family members, neighbors, but non-Muslims. This is an important aspect of our conduct. So Ramadan is an important time for Muslims to contemplate, to reflect on the, and actually, we spend our lives so busy in what we call in dunya, in the world, work, whatever, making ends meet. Do we actually have time to reflect on what our outcome is going to be when we leave this world? Are we going to leave it with people remember us in a good manner, or are people going to be say, oh, that he was a bad one?
You've mentioned things like reflection, for example. You've talked about humility and humbleness. You've talked about doing what's being prescribed to us for our spiritual well-being, if you like. One of the things I expected you to say, because it's one of the understandings I've always had as an outsider about Ramadan and the sacrifices that are made, is that it's also about appreciation, appreciating all the small things that we have in life. Would you agree with that and expand on it?
When we sit down and when we open our fast, right, we should be thinking, what about the person in another country who hasn't got any food? Or the homeless person, the next time we meet an homeless person, what about them? So it comes with you reflecting from your own self. Right? You can only appreciate something if you value it. And that's the key. What value do we impose on that behavior or that action? Have an appreciation for things, for people, whatever it is, comes down to your own value judgment. What do you put on that? So, one of the famous scholars said, the most important bit of food that you eat when you open your fast is the first morsel. The first morsel that goes in your mouth. That's the most blessed morsel of food, because that's the first one that goes in your mouth. So you should be able to reflect, right? If I've got food on my table, right, and to a relative degree, most people have what they want to eat. But some people, unfortunately, just get what they get. But I should reflect as a Muslim, what about that person who hasn't got a choice of food? So one of the things that Muslims are prescribed to do is give some money within Ramadan, right? It's called fidya, right, to the poor. It's like an amount of money that will cover like a meal, to make you think about how other people might live and how other people might be feeling. So there's that aspect, but it's grounded in the idea of your own value, what value you put on something. And so Ramadan is an important period. Like I said, go back to reflecting on what's my own value judgment. Can I conduct myself in a more meaningful manner, a more productive manner? Can I be a better human being? Because it's not about being just a better Muslim, it's about being a better human being. Better human being physically, mentally, and spiritually.
What would you advise to anybody who is not a Muslim, how they can incorporate Ramadan into their own lives? Would you say, for example, that it would be a really good idea for them to maybe set aside one day in a month, if they're not a Muslim, just one day in a month when they make that sacrifice, and go through a similar process of reflection?
Here, I'd give a little bit of a caveat, and I think that's down to individual people's own assumptions, but more people's own values regarding what they see as beneficial for themselves, right? Like I said previously, there's a lot of people are now, especially athletes, are doing intermittent fasting because they've appreciated the benefits for them. Personally speaking, they've had benefits from it, or they see the benefits, or they've tried it out. So I think it's about individual own perspective on what they want to take from Ramadan, or whether they want to fast and try it out, whether they feel it's beneficial for them, whether from a weight loss perspective or as a mechanism for allowing their body to recoup or whatever. The other aspect is regarding the self-reflection, because Muslims are prescribed to give charity, to do lots of good works, to reflect on their own behaviour within a normal working life. I think anybody can benefit from that. You don't have to be a Muslim to benefit. I think the world would be a much better place if people reflected on what they said, and on what they did and how they impact on other people. And I think an important point here is fanaticism is born out of ignorance. If you're ignorant of another person's position or opinion, right, you can never truly understand why they've come to that decision in the first place. If you don't take the time out to actually think about or talk to them or engage them, right, about why and what. And I think one of the reasons why I normally don't do this kind of thing, and obviously you're aware of it, but I think for me it's about informing people and opening the dialogue. One reason why I probably decided to do this is because it's about opening a discourse, a discussion. Because obviously there'll be people out there who may not know what the purpose of Ramadan is, or them, might have a really kind of like a skewed or backward opinion on why Muslims fast. And I've heard it many times. Oh, I couldn't do that. It's really, really, really odd. Well, it actually isn't. It's about increasing your willpower. And another aspect of why in Ramadan we should reflect, because throughout our normal 11 months of the year, we deal with people, and sometimes we just don't think, we just open our mouths without actually thinking, and there's a really interesting idea, and it obviously it comes from psychology, where the emotion reaction cycle, where a person has a stimulus, and if just show you my hand, a stimulus comes in and straight to reaction, if there's no thinking going on. Okay, so people with, for example, anger management issues, what tends to happen is they have a stimulus come in, it just hits emotion explosion, no thinking, straight through to reaction. And what you try to do is you're trying to increase in the brain thinking, so actually have that emotion, they actually think about what they're going to do, and then have the outcome. So here, then that's the idea about Ramadan and self-reflection. Am I reflecting on how I spoke to the person or this person, or how I conducted myself, or why did that person feel that way? Was it maybe something I said? So that's a really important aspect. But as I said before, in terms of non-Muslims, Muslims, but generally across the board, it's an opportunity to open dialogue, and I think that's an important aspect of human development, or our societies and our cultures, and having a mixing pot, kind of through communities. And the reason why some communities are very fractured is because there's no discussion. There's no putting out the olive leaf and actually having a discussion about the finer details, and actually people being scared. And what I would say to your viewers, people viewing these, especially those who are non-Muslim, is don't be scared to ask.
You've given me a lot of food for thought, excuse the pun there, with regards to Ramadan. But is there anything that you haven't mentioned that you think that you would like to before we close in the last minute? What would your last word on Ramadan be?
I'd probably say just it's a time of reflection and contemplation, and trying to build a relationship up with your creator and building a relationship up with the people around you, and conducting yourself in a more productive and conducive manner. Reflecting on how we deal with people, and what we say, what we do, what we think, and how we, generally how we conduct ourselves, especially as Muslims, how we conduct ourselves as good, pious Muslims, and that's something about how we serve our community, how we serve our neighbours, other people who aren't Muslim, and I think that's an important aspect of Ramadan. That we go through that self-reflection process, and we try and iron out the faults that we have, and look at how we deal with people in a very respectful adult manner, where our ego doesn't spoil the conversation, where we can have a two-way discussion in life, but it's not always me, myself, and I. Where it's kind of two-way flow, and where people can feel comfortable to ask, and also people can be comfortable to reply.
Thank you very much for giving me your time today. I really appreciate it, and I know that I was the one who asked you to do this. And I know in some ways I put a lot on your shoulders to come out and act as a spokesperson for Islam and to talk about Ramadan.
Yeah, no problem. It's fine.
You've been really clear, and I really appreciate it.
All I say is, if there's any mistakes, the mistakes are mine and not from Islam.
Okay, so again, thank you very much, Saj. For you at home who's watching this, do subscribe if you've enjoyed it. We'll be covering a lot of topics, and tune in to see what I'm going to be exploring next time. Take care of each other and yourselves. Bye-bye.